Mars in the fourth house, the fire beneath the floor. Welcome to Mars in the fourth house in Synastry. In this overlay, we explore what happens when one person's Mars falls into another person's fourth house. The house of home, family of origin, private life, emotional foundations, and the innermost sanctuary of the self that exists beneath all public presentation. This is one of the most intimate and consequential placements in Synastry, and one that carries some of the most serious implications of any Mars overlay. It does not operate in the social world or the professional domain. It does not play out in conversation or in the body at first meeting. It operates in the home, in the private, enclosed space where a person is most unguarded, most vulnerable, and most fundamentally themselves. What Mars brings into that space matters enormously because there is nowhere further to retreat from it. The fourth house is the innermost room. When Mars enters it through another person's chart, it enters the place where the house person has the least armor and the most at stake. The fourth house governs what is most foundational in a person's life, not in the material sense of the second house, but in the psychological and emotional sense. It is the house of roots, of the family one was born into, the early experiences that shaped one's emotional baseline, the private interior life that rarely, if ever, becomes fully visible to the outside world. It is the house of the home in every sense, the literal dwelling, yes, but also the inner home, the emotional ground on which a person stands when everything else has been stripped away. In traditional astrology, the fourth house is an angular house, which gives it considerable strength and prominence in the chart. It is also associated with the end of matters, with what remains when things have run their course, with the deepest and most enduring layer of a person's experience. What happens in the fourth house does not stay on the surface. It goes down into the roots, and it stays there. Mars, as a malefic planet of force, friction, and activating pressure, is not naturally at ease in the fourth house. The fourth house asks for security, containment, and emotional safety. Mars provides motion, heat, and the persistent application of force against whatever it encounters. These are not complementary energies. They are, in a meaningful sense, opposing ones, and the tension between them is the central dynamic of this overlay, present whether or not either person is fully conscious of it. From the Mars person's perspective, the house person's private world is immediately compelling in some deep and not entirely comfortable way. The Mars person is drawn into the house person's domestic and emotional interior, into their home, their family history, their private habits and vulnerabilities, with an energy that is more penetrating than it is tender. The Mars person may feel a genuine desire to be part of the house person's innermost life, to establish themselves in the house person's home and private world, to contribute their energy to the building or maintaining of a shared domestic space. There is often a real drive here toward domesticity, toward making a home together, toward being present in the most private layer of each other's daily existence. The Mars person may also find themselves stirred by the house person's emotional life in ways they do not always know how to handle well. The fourth house is the domain of feeling at its most unguarded, and Mars is not a planet that responds to vulnerability with natural gentleness. The Mars person may push into emotional territory before the house person is ready, press for confrontation when the house person needs quiet, or bring an intensity into the private space of the relationship that the house person experiences as destabilizing rather than vitalizing. This is not necessarily intentional. Mars acts before it reflects, and in the fourth house, that tendency plays out in the domain where the house person has the least capacity to absorb careless force. From the house person's perspective, the Mars person's energy arrives in the most protected and essential layer of their existence. At its best, this can feel like genuine activation of the domestic and emotional life, like the arrival of someone who brings real energy and presence into a home that may have felt stagnant, too quiet, or lacking in vitality. The Mars person can make the house person's private world feel more alive, more engaged, more inhabited. There is a quality of warmth and heat that Mars brings into domestic space that can, under the right conditions, feel genuinely welcoming. The sense that the home is now a place where something is actually happening, where life has a charge to it that it lacked before. But the house person will also feel, perhaps more acutely than in any other overlay, the full weight of what it means to have Mars operating in their most undefended space. The fourth house is where a person goes to recover, to be alone with themselves, to feel safe from the demands and pressures of the outside world. When Mars enters this space through another person's chart, it brings those demands and pressures inside the sanctuary. The house person may find that there is no longer anywhere in their life that feels fully restful, that even at home, even in their most private moments, the activating and sometimes abrasive energy of Mars is present, pushing, pressing, generating friction in a space that was meant to offer relief from exactly that. At its most constructive, this overlay produces a domestic life that is genuinely energized and engaged, a home that is alive with shared activity, shared ambition, and a quality of passionate investment in the private world both people are building together. The Mars person brings drive and initiative into the domestic sphere, taking on practical challenges with genuine enthusiasm, pushing the shared home life toward greater vitality and purpose. The house person grounds the Mars person's energy in something real and rooted, providing the emotional depth and the sense of genuine belonging that gives the Mars person's drive a direction worth pursuing. There is real passion possible here in the private dimension of the relationship, a quality of intensity in the intimate domestic life that more passive overlays cannot always sustain. This overlay can also produce a relationship in which both people are willing to engage honestly with the deeper emotional and family of origin material that the fourth house contains. Mars does not allow things to remain buried for long. In the fourth house, this means that old wounds, inherited patterns, and unresolved emotional history are likely to be surfaced. Not always gently, but surfaced nonetheless. For couples who have the capacity to work with what comes up, this can be genuinely transformative. Mars in the fourth does not permit the emotional basement to remain undisturbed, and sometimes what needs to happen is exactly that kind of disturbance. The shadow dimension of this overlay is where Mars's malefic nature becomes most serious, and it must be addressed with full honesty because the fourth house is the home, and what Mars can do in the home, when its energy is expressed without restraint or awareness, is among the most damaging things any synastry overlay can produce. At the level of ordinary difficulty, Mars in the fourth house generates domestic conflict, persistent, recurring arguments that play out in the private space of the home, and that carry an emotional charge disproportionate to their apparent surface subject. The home becomes a place of tension rather than restoration. The house person finds that the domestic environment, which is meant to be their most restorative space, has instead become a source of chronic stress. Arguments erupt over household matters, over space, over routine, over the management of the shared environment. But beneath these surface conflicts is the deeper issue of the Mars person's energy consistently disrupting the emotional climate of the house person's most private and foundational domain. The Mars person may not be conscious of the degree to which their presence in this domain is destabilizing. Mars acts on instinct and appetite, and in the fourth house, that instinct pushes toward dominance of the domestic and emotional space, toward being the loudest, the most forceful, the most emotionally imposing presence in the home. The house person, whose fundamental need in the fourth house is for safety and emotional containment, may find themselves in the impossible position of feeling least safe in the place that is supposed to be their sanctuary. At the more serious end of the spectrum, Mars in the fourth house is one of the overlays most directly associated with domestic violence. This must be stated plainly. The combination of Mars's capacity for physical force and aggression with the enclosed, private, unwitnessed space of the home creates conditions in which the worst expressions of Mars's malefic nature can occur without external check or accountability. The fourth house is, by definition, behind closed doors. Mars behind closed doors, operating without restraint, directed at the person whose home it has entered, is a configuration that traditional and modern astrology alike recognize as genuinely dangerous. This is not an outcome that every instance of this overlay produces. It is not even a common outcome in most charts. But it is a real possibility that belongs to the complete and honest picture of what Mars in the fourth house can become. And to omit it would be to fail the people who most need to recognize it. The distinction between the vitalizing and the destructive expressions of this overlay rests on the Mars person's relationship to the concept of sanctuary. Whether they understand the fourth house as a space that belongs fundamentally to the house person's need for safety and restoration, and orient their energy accordingly, or whether they treat the home as simply another domain to be dominated, another space in which their force can operate without consequence. Mars does not naturally understand sanctuary. It must learn to. In the fourth house, the willingness or unwillingness to learn that is the central determinant of what this overlay ultimately produces. At its highest expression, Mars in the fourth house creates a domestic life of genuine passion, emotional honesty, and shared vitality, a home that is alive and engaged, a private world in which both people feel the real and sustaining energy of someone who is fully present and fully invested. The Mars person's drive becomes a force in service of the shared home rather than a disruption of it. The house person's emotional depth gives the Mars person's energy its most meaningful and grounded direction. When balanced, Mars in the fourth house creates domestic vitality, emotional honesty, passionate private life, and a home that is genuinely inhabited by two people who bring their full selves into the shared space they are building. When imbalanced, it produces chronic domestic conflict, the erosion of the house person's sense of safety in their own home, and, at its most destructive, the conversion of the sanctuary into a site of harm, in which the person who was meant to share the home becomes instead its most threatening presence within it. What this overlay ultimately demands is that the Mars person answer, honestly, and not once but continuously, a question that Mars is not naturally inclined to sit with. Does the energy I bring into this person's most private and foundational space make it more of a home or less of one?
Thank you for listening. This was Mars in the fourth house. Next, we explore Mars in the fifth house in synastry overlays.